In this lecture module, we'll pivot to discussing the two theories of concepts that frame our discussion in the chapter. We'll begin with the classical theory of concepts. We'll note that the classical theory of concepts holds that someone possesses a concept only in those cases where they have knowledge of a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that are determinative of membership in the class corresponding to the concept. We'll list a number of concepts that are amenable to this sort of approach, as well as other advantages that the classical theory of concepts might claim for itself. Then we'll turn our attention to problems with the classical view. We'll begin by noticing that people use concepts with great facility and ease despite being unable to express the set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that would be required under the classical theory of concepts. We'll use furniture to illustrate this point. Then we'll turn our attention to a second problem. Many of the properties that would seem to compose a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for concepts are properties that human beings don't have any sensory mechanisms that would allow them to detect. As a result, it doesn't seem clear how human beings would be able to categorize these objects under the classical view of concepts. As an illustration of this, we'll talk about water. Finally, we'll end the discussion of the classical view by noting that the classical theory of concepts has no mechanism for explaining typicality effects. In fact, it predicts that there will be no typicality effects. And we'll again use as our example to illustrate this point the concept of furniture. Early work on concepts focused primarily upon concepts of concrete objects and how we categorize them. First theory explored by psychologists was a favorite among philosophers like Gottlieb Frege here. Concepts give the necessary and sufficient conditions, i.e. a formula that picks out all and only the objects that fall into the category. In short, our concepts were just like very good definitions. Moreover, the meanings of our words were just dictated by the concepts that the words signify. In possessing the concept, you have a complete handle on the object. Some concepts are plausible candidates for this view. For example, kin concepts like grandmother and father, triangle, and other mathematical concepts, legal concepts that emerge as the result of precising or stipulative definition. All of these concepts are plausibly subsumed under the classical theory of concepts. So the classical view has a number of advantages that might recommend it. First, it forms a strong bond between our linguistic terms and the corresponding concepts. Secondly, there are a number of words in the English language that seem amenable to the classical theory of concepts treatment of concepts. For example, your grandmother is simply the mother of your mother. Additionally, and this is probably why philosophers find the theory so attractive, the classical view of concepts suggests that possession of a concept provides you with a deep and abiding insight into the nature of the thing so conceived. If one has a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions, one can always discriminate between members of that class and objects, properties, events, and relations that do not fall under that class. One can do so for any object at any time and do so infallibly. We have, in effect, the insight into the essential nature of the things as we've conceptualized them. And that would be very powerful if, in fact, we could have a number of concepts like that. Having presented the classical theory of concepts together with some of the advantages that it might claim for itself, let's turn our attention now to some of the weaknesses that people have identified for the theory. 3 problems are generally cited as conclusive reasons to reject the classical view as a general view of concepts. First, people seem to possess concepts without the ability to specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for membership in the category. In fact, people oftentimes are quite facile at using concepts without even the slightest ability to specify anything that would approach the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for being a member of that category. So, for instance, if you were to categorize instances of furniture, you would be quite facile and it would be quite effortless for you to do so. But if I asked you to come up with a general definition of what it is that constitutes furniture, you would probably have a much more difficult time. Second, for large numbers of concepts, humans don't seem to have any sensory apparatus sensitive to the essential properties definitive of these concepts. For instance, we sense a colorless, odorless, tasteless liquid that quenches thirst, i.e. water, but we have no sense capable of detecting molecular composition, i.e. H2O, and surely its molecular composition is part of its essential nature, part of a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions if ever there were some. Third, the classical approach predicts that all instances are equally members of the category. Either you're in the category or you're not, and once you're in, everyone is the same. Hence, we shouldn't discover that people find some instances of categories and concepts more typical than others. However, researchers discovered that people do, in fact, find some instances more typical than others. Third, the classical approach predicts that all instances are equally members of the category. Once you're in the category, there is no differentiation between one instance and another. They're all equally representative of the category. Hence, we should not discover that people find some instances more typical than other instances of a given category. However, researchers discovered that people do, in fact, find some instances more typical than others for a wide variety of concepts. Similarly, concepts exhibit a certain inherent vagueness that makes categorization degrade as cases become more atypical. And none of these features of human categorization behavior are features that the classical theory of concepts is capable of easily predicting or explaining. Let's take a closer look at typicality then. Researchers have come up with a number of ways of measuring relative typicality. How often subjects mention a particular item like an apple, or how quickly they mention it when you ask them to list off instances of fruit. Using all these sorts of metrics, you get ratings that indicate the relative typicality of particular fruits to the people in an experiment. This particular experiment and the particular numbers were given to us by Malt and Smith from a paper they published in 1984. We clearly see that apples are much more typical than raisins or olives. And so we can see that there's a gradation of typicality that our behaviors exhibit. Moreover, typicality ratings predict performance, usually in terms of reaction time, for a variety of categorization, memory, naming, and reasoning tests. The more typical the instance is of a category, the easier the task. Worse still, for the classical view, these typical effects are due to unnecessary properties, properties unlikely to be part of a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to prototype theory as an instance of a general class of theories referred to as similarity or probability theories. And we'll see how they attempt to deal with actual categorization behaviors that seem so troubling for the classical theory of concepts.